Well, you're watching the press preview. A first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the Financial Times' Whitehall editor, Sebastian Payne, and the Daily Telegraph's chief political correspondent, Camilla Turner. So let's see what's on some of those front pages. No real prizes for guessing then. The Metro leads on that England victory, the first win since the men in 1966, with the headline, "No more years of hurt." The Sun has gone for a double-page spread captioned, "Move over, fellas, it's home." Also, the lead story in the Mail, which says, "It wasn't a dream. We did beat Germany in a final." The Guardian calls the England women's team game changers after their historic win at Wembley. And away from football, the Telegraph says that Rishi Sunak has promised to bring in the biggest income tax cut for 30 years. And the Financial Times reports that some European governments have eased efforts to curb trade in Russian oil because of concerns about inflation. And just to let you know, by scanning the QR code you'll see on the screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of those papers while you watch us analysing them. And as I say, we're joined by Sebastian Payne and Camilla Turner. So let's dive straight in. And I pretty much know what you were doing earlier in the evening. And so, Camilla, no more years of hurt in the Metro. Clever use of, what was it? It was 30 years of hurt originally in the song, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. This football victory we've had is completely dominating the front pages for tomorrow, and rightly so. From the tabloids to the broadsheets, it's what everyone's wanting to really trumpet on their front page. I think it's a fantastic result, and I think the Queen's tributes talking about how this is really going to be an inspiration to younger girls and women across the country. I think that's such an important point, because it's not just this moment of national triumph and victory for the women's team, but it's also what it signifies in a broader sense about really elevating women's football to a sort of higher level and serving as that inspiration for the younger generation.
And Sebastian, I mean, it is lots of discussion now about that legacy. And if we want to get more young people, particularly girls, involved in sport, well, football is one of the best ways of doing it.
Absolutely. And look, I'm not going to confess to be a specialist in this particular area, but I watched the match this evening and it was just incredible drama and great game. And I don't want to give any professional analysis on how good it was compared to other football, but as a pure punter, I absolutely loved it. And for this snobbish, snidey people who are still saying stupid things on social media about this, then I think this needs to take a look at themselves and look at what an amazing triumph this is. But it is a reminder about the access that there's just simply not there, particularly at school levels. You know, I think back to my own school days, we were still very much gender segregated into boys do football, girls do netball. And I think the inspiration we've seen from the Lionesses is an example that should be taken to the whole country. And without presaging the next story we're going to talk about, I was very amused to see a press notice drop from Rishi Sunak's campaign 1 minute after the result came through, promising greater access for women, for girls to football if he wins the Tory leadership campaign. So I imagine we'll see something similar from Liz Truss too, because obviously everyone looks at this, and as Camilla was just saying, it becomes a big unifying national moment and just such a great triumph, and good to have some unadulterated good news that everyone can celebrate for once.
Interesting about those tweets then, pre-written and the finger poised for the final whistle. So, Camilla, let's have me staying on the theme. Got to, haven't we? Why not the Daily Mail? And the team that was beaten, well, it wasn't a dream. We did beat Germany in a final. And, of course, all those references back to 1966. That's what the men did. But, Germany were the favourites, I suppose, given their pedigree.
Yes, that's right. I mean, again, I'm not going to profess to be an expert in football, but everyone knows that Germany are constantly winning these major titles. They're known to be this incredibly strong team and probably were the favourites to win, just looking at their track record. So I think it's all the more impressive that the English women's team have managed to completely overturn that and for what is a very big moment in our national footballing history, won this really major title. First time in over half a century that we've won something this big, and all the more fantastic that it's the women's team doing it for us. So I think it's been the whole way through this Euros tournament, there's been so much energy and so much enthusiasm around the women's game. It's amazing that it was played on home turf and that the crowds were all out supporting them, and it emerged to be this fantastic victory.
Let's discuss played on home turf, as you say. And, you know, there's, well, I suppose two big songs that surround these international tournaments now. Football's Coming Home and Sweet Caroline. A bit of Vindaloo thrown in there. I'm sure that's your favourite one, Sebastian. The Sun, Move Over Fellas, It's Home. And that actually does particularly irk the international footballing authorities, doesn't it? UEFA and FIFA. I mean, some FIFA officials have said that's one reason why we're a bit hesitant in giving you the next Men's World Cup, because you assume that it's your game.
Oh, well, look, I mean, like, Three Lines is such a great song. It's something I remember from my childhood in 1996. So when we had, obviously, the tournament a couple of years ago, when it was, again, totally ubiquitous across everywhere in the country, it's a parody song. It's not about a triumphantist xenophobic expression. It's simply mocking the fact that so much national energy and effort is put into our sporting prowess. And when you listen to the lyrics of Three Lines, which, again, are very witty and funny, they get to this exact point. So I think there are some po-faced people who don't quite understand the mood it's taken in. But as I said, I think it is just such a good moment. What I'd much rather see from the Premier League and from the FA is getting female football on parity with male football, because it's obviously something they've not taken seriously for many years. And I think if you look at the outpouring of happiness to this, but going back to what I said earlier about what most people would see as the sheer quality of the game, then it's something that is long, long overdue. And one thing I was struck by as well, if you think back to when we had those the Euro performances a couple of years ago, some of the scenes at Wembley Stadium were really quite appalling, and there was a lot of criticism of the police for people for sort of quite yobbish behaviour. But I think actually it's been a very, very different atmosphere, and I've spoken to friends who've been at Wembley Stadium tonight. And again, I think that's very much part of how you can improve the game, by making sure men and females football are finally seen on an equal level.
Absolutely, and very different on the pitch as well. Much less simulation and rolling around like you've been shot by a sniper when you've hardly been touched. But let's move on. Let's get on, Camilla, to your paper. And that leadership contest that Sebastian was mentioning there. And you've got, the Telegraph's got Zahawi, Nadeem Zahawi, the Chancellor, comes off the fence to give Booster Truss his backing. So that's another big scalp for the Truss campaign.
Yes, that's right. And it's been a pretty big few days in terms of high-profile backers coming out for Liz Truss, because we've also had Ben Wallace and Tom Tugendhat. So this is now three quite big names in close succession, all coming out for Liz Truss. Nadeem Zahawi had previously said, as soon as he was knocked out of the leadership contest, he said, I won't be commenting further, but clearly he has broken his silence to come out for Liz Truss. And he explains the reason why, saying that he prefers her booster economic approach compared to the Rishi Sunak doomster attitude. So he's really getting behind the Liz Truss economic vision of tax cuts, and that will encourage growth, saying this is the right way to do it. And I suppose given that he is the current Chancellor, that does lend some weight to her argument. Of course, there are other former leadership contenders who are behind Rishi Sunak. We've got Jeremy Hunt and Greg Hands both behind him. So it's not to say all the former leadership contestants have come out for Liz Truss, but certainly in the past few days, we've seen these different big names, and it really shows there's a bit of a momentum gathering behind her, and clearly a feeling in some quarters of the Conservative Party that at this stage in the race, she's really looking like the favourite to win.
Oh, OK. Listen, we're pretty much out of time for this section. We'll be getting Sebastian's thoughts on that and other dimensions of the leadership contest in a moment or two. And coming up after the break, we've got this in the Financial Times. The West eases Russian oil curbs as inflation and energy risks mount. Welcome back. You're watching the press preview right here on Sky News. With me now are the Whitehall editor of the Financial Times, Sebastian Payne, and chief political correspondent at the Daily Telegraph, Camilla Turner. Right, let's continue with the Financial Times. Sebastian, the West eases Russian oil curbs as inflation and energy risks mount. So just tell us how that's easing and, what it tells us about the resolve to make Russia feel financial pain.
Well, when this whole crisis began, the response from all EU members and across the West was very strong. And the simple reason was that they saw a very clear dividing line about this. The simple fact that, obviously Russia had invaded Ukraine and should be punished. But we're obviously a good sort of almost 6 months into that, since that invasion, and the economic consequences that are becoming very real. We were talking before the break about the Tory leadership contest, and so much of that is dominated by the economy. And that's because inflation is high and it's getting pretty set in for a long period of time. And so you're starting to see these tensions emerge from several European countries about what you should do about this to try and ease it for ordinary people. And the story we have on the front of the FT tomorrow is the EU is looking at amending some of the restrictions on the insurance of ships, which again were introduced to make life harder for Russia to try and help oil exports around the globe. And that's again this big concern about energy supplies. And there was a moment last week in the UK where we almost had blackouts in parts of London because there wasn't enough energy, and the UK had to pay astronomical prices to buy electricity through the interconnector that goes to Europe. And that might all sound quite complex, but the fact is the energy crisis is real. It's about to get a lot worse, and Western governments are going to face more difficult challenges about how tough and how sustained you want to be on Russia when you're facing these problems at home. And so far, the West has been entirely united on this, eventually, the UK being at the forefront in terms of sanctions, but I think there will start to be more dividing lines as we get into the winter and the energy crisis becomes more acute.
Just briefly on that, Sebastian, on the UK being at the forefront of sanctions, also in this article is a very interesting line here from an underwriting director at Lloyd's Market Association saying there is no current UK ban affecting global shipments of Russian oil, and the UK is, of course, the centre of the maritime insurance industry.
And again, there's been discussions about that kind of ban for some period of time, pretty much since the war began. But as I said, that comes with very high economic consequences. And the West has tried to isolate Russia as much as possible. And that's obviously led to this big rise in energy prices and the big rise of inflation across the world there. So I think there is this difficult balance. And I think whoever's the next prime minister will have to face more and more of these questions later this year.
OK, Camilla, let's stay with Ukraine and the Russians, as we've just been discussing there, weaponising, so to speak, energy, also weaponising food supplies. And this on the Telegraph in the business section, a little piece on the front page as well. Ukraine crop likely to halve, warns President Zelensky. I mean, that really is worrying.
Yes, exactly. This is a very clear example of the broader impact of the war in Ukraine really rippling out throughout the rest of the world with this latest warning from Zelensky. Because if Ukraine's food output, its exports halve, that it causes really serious problems for other countries, particularly African nations and developing countries that really rely on these Ukrainian crops. It's known as the breadbasket of Europe because it has such a huge export market for these crops. And it just goes to show that Russia's invasion of Ukraine isn't just a limited regional problem. It actually is impacting in a much broader way. There have been efforts underway to try and get the grain and get the crops out of Ukraine, give them safe passage to leave. But clearly Zelensky is still very concerned and still issuing this warning that this just isn't going to work, and the normal amounts of crops simply won't be able to be exported in the way that we might hope they are.
Yeah, we're all very concerned. Back to the Conservative leadership campaign. Quick thoughts from both of you on this. It looks like a U-turn of colossal size here. Camilla, Sunak pledges 4% income tax cut, front of the Daily Telegraph. Well, I mean, this is a man who, as Chancellor and as candidate, says, well, we can't afford them at the moment and tax cuts will be inflationary.
Yes, exactly. This has really been seized on by Liz Truss's campaign as yet another U-turn. They're accusing Rishi Sunak of flip-flopping all over the place when it comes to tax cuts. Of course, Rishi Sunak's whole pledge, his whole economic vision is that we can't possibly cut taxes now because we need to keep a lid on inflation. And he argues that this latest policy from him about the income tax break is still consistent with his vision, because he's saying, I'll cut income tax by the end of the next parliament. So once I've got inflation under control, then I'll deal with the tax breaks. But of course, from Liz Truss's camp's perspective, they're saying, well, the whole point of you is that you're talking about we shouldn't have these tax breaks, but here you are now introducing this 11th hour tax break.
OK, just a minute left then, Sebastian, on that. I mean, does this smack of desperation by the Sunak camp, such a U-turn?
Well, the thing about this quite odd announcement is that it's announcing an income tax cut in 2028, and the whole thing is predicated on the Conservatives winning the next general election, which would be a fifth election victory, which the party has never done before. And I think most commentators would look at the polls and say that's going to be an uphill battle. So it's very much jammed tomorrow in a promise here, and Mr. Sunak has promised to cut income tax by 1p in 2024. So that would be the only cut really before the next general election is due. All this would come in a subsequent parliament. And I think a lot of people will look at this and say, this all seems rather odd, because he stood on a platform of so-called sound money, of tackling inflation before tax cuts, and the last week has announced two major tax cuts, this one and also slashing VAT on energy bills. And so it doesn't feel as if it's all going to plan for Mr. Sunak at the moment. We've got 3 more hustings to come and another 5 weeks of this lovely contest.